Hi everyone, my name is Hugh Nelson. I'm the Bishop of St Germans. It's been a long and hard pandemic for many of us, and that continues to be the case for many people in this country and for even more elsewhere, especially in the places which are not blessed by access to vaccination programs in the way that we know them. And we know that although things are getting back to normal, please God that continues, well, the consequences of COVID are going to be felt for many, many years, and some of the most serious consequences are yet to hit us. There is much to rebuild. The question, though, is what will we rebuild? What will we as society choose to rebuild? What will we as church choose to rebuild? And to add to the complication, what kind of rebuilding are we looking for? After all, there are quite different kinds of rebuilding available. Just think as an example, as a kind of thought experiment of what happens to church buildings when disaster strikes. Take, for example, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It suffered terrible damage in the fire of 2019. Well, the decision there, rebuild like for like, so that what rises again is as close as possible to the original. Is that our aim? To get things back as closely as possible to the way things were? Or take Coventry Cathedral. That suffered even worse damage in the bombing of World War II. The decision there? Well, leave the ruin as a symbol of violence and suffering and build something completely new next to it as a sign of hope and reconciliation, and then connect the two. Is that our goal? To leave some things behind and to build something new and to do the two things in partnership together? Or how about St Paul's Cathedral? That wasn't just damaged, it was completely destroyed in the Great Fire of London. The decision there? Clear the space, start again, build something that carries the same name, that's in the same place, but that's completely different from the great medieval original. Is that what we go for? A completely new start? Not every rebuild looks the same. What will we decide to rebuild after this time of damage and destruction? And how will we go about it? Well, at first glance, perhaps, Nehemiah doesn't have that much to contribute as we try to answer that question. After all, his task was really clear, and it was also really specific to his time: rebuild the defensive perimeter of Jerusalem. And, well, let's be honest, the last thing that we need in the world at the moment are more walls. But Nehemiah's wall wasn't really the point, was it? Of course, Jerusalem mattered to the Jewish people, and of course, the protection of those who lived there in a dangerous and threatening world really mattered. But Nehemiah knew that simply building defensive walls wasn't what was needed. What was needed was a community that trusted God, that continued to know, to tell, to live out, to improvise the great story of a faithful, good and gracious God. And that story, a story that we inherit today, had very nearly been snuffed out as the great empires of the Middle East swept through Israel over and over again, destroying Jerusalem, exiling its people, challenging its faith really deeply. And in the 4th and 5th chapters of the story that we're reading, it starts to become clear that Nehemiah has a much bigger plan in mind than just rebuilding a wall. Because he isn't just rebuilding a wall, he's rebuilding a people. He's restoring their confidence that they are known, called and blessed by God, that they have been given a great task, that they are the inheritors of, the tellers of, the improvisers of a great story. And it's a story that has to carry on being told. It's the story of a creator God who longs to see his world restored and rebuilt. It's the story of a fierce God who hates injustice. It's the story of a faithful God who never abandons or leaves his people. And so Nehemiah gets to work rebuilding his wall, and because he knows this is really about rebuilding a community, he invites everyone to play their part. There is a place in this work for everyone. And because he knows this is a divine work, he's straightforward and honest about how difficult it will be. And when that turns out to be true and it gets really hard, he sticks to the task. Because doing God's work was never meant to be easy. And because he knows that how you do something matters as much as the outcome, he will not tolerate any injustice or oppression to be built into the wall. And so he gives up his own salary, and he demands that wealth be shared out, and he works consistently to narrow the gap between rich and poor. And because he knows that community is built when people share a vision and a task, and when they gather round a table for food and for laughter and for fellowship, well, he makes sure that everyone eats together and does so often. Sure, Nehemiah built a wall, but his real aim was to rebuild a community, the community of God's people whose task was to keep on telling and living the story of their faithful God. And that, it seems to me, is Nehemiah's gift to us as we set out to rebuild and to restore. Our task is not to return to what was as if we can just turn the clock back to the way things were before COVID. The world was already changing. The pandemic has just sped that up. No, our task is to remain utterly focused on building faithful communities, big and small, Methodist, Catholic, Free Church, Anglican, that know the story of a faithful God, that live it out in service and grace and acts of mercy, and that share it freely and boldly with a culture that is rapidly forgetting who God is. And just like with Nehemiah and his wall, well, there's a place in this work for every believer. Everyone who follows Jesus has a part to play. And just like with Nehemiah and his wall, it will sometimes be hard. After all, we don't do God's work because it's easy, but because it's true. And just like with Nehemiah and his wall, how we do it, with justice and generosity and grace, well, that matters as much as the outcome. And just like with Nehemiah and his wall, as we go about it, we must do so with laughter and joy and friendship. And my prayer for you, for all of us, that we may each know the faithfulness of God, just as Nehemiah did, that you may respond to his call with the same faith and courage and determination as he did, as we together keep alive the story of God in a complex and changing world. I pray it for you, today and always. Amen.